March 1943. Bletchley Park, England. In a cramped wooden hut that smelled of stale tea and cigarette smoke, 16-year-old Margaret Foster sat hunched over a desk covered in columns of seemingly random letters, her fingers stained with ink, her eyes burning from 12 consecutive hours of work. Around her, dozens of other women, most barely out of school themselves, performed the same tedious task, searching for patterns in intercepted German naval communications that had stumped Britain's most brilliant mathematical minds for months. What none of them knew, what Margaret herself could not have imagined as she rubbed her tired eyes and reached for her worn leather diary to record yet another frustrating day, was that the simple habit her grandmother had taught her, keeping a personal shorthand system for her most private thoughts, would become the key to unlocking one of the most sophisticated encryption systems ever devised. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. The breakthrough that would emerge from Margaret's diary would not only revolutionize Allied naval intelligence, but would directly contribute to the defeat of 7 German submarines in the North Atlantic, saving an estimated 3,000 Allied sailors' lives and altering the course of the conflict at sea. Yet her name would remain classified for more than 50 years, lost in the vast machinery of wartime secrecy that both protected and erased the contributions of countless young women who served in Britain's most secret facility. Margaret Foster had arrived at Bletchley Park in January of 1943. Recruited not for any particular academic brilliance, she had barely completed her secondary education, but because of a typing test administered at her local employment office in Liverpool. She had scored remarkably high on pattern recognition and had demonstrated an unusual ability to maintain focus during repetitive tasks. These seemingly mundane skills were precisely what the government code and cipher school needed for its expanding operations against German naval communications. The facility at Bletchley Park had grown from a handful of eccentric academics and mathematicians in 1939 to a sprawling operation employing more than 9,000 people by early 1943. Most were women like Margaret, young, working class, sworn to absolute secrecy about work they barely understood. They were told only what they needed to know to perform their specific task, nothing more. The bigger picture, the strategic importance of their labor, remained deliberately obscured. Margaret was assigned to Hut 8, the section responsible for breaking German naval codes. By early 1943, the codebreakers had achieved remarkable success against the Enigma machine used by the German surface fleet and U-boats operating in home waters. But a new challenge had emerged that threatened to blind Allied intelligence at the most critical juncture of the Battle of the Atlantic. In February of 1943, German Naval Command had introduced a modified encryption system for U-boats operating in the mid-Atlantic convoy routes. This system, which British intelligence designated Triton, employed a 4-rotor Enigma machine instead of the standard 3-rotor model. The additional rotor exponentially increased the possible combinations, from approximately 17,000 positions to more than 200 billion. It was, German naval cryptographers believed, absolutely unbreakable. The impact was immediate and devastating. Allied convoy losses, which had been declining thanks to improved intelligence, suddenly spiked. In March of 1943 alone, German submarines operating in the Atlantic sank more than 100 Allied merchant vessels, killing thousands of sailors and destroying hundreds of thousands of tons of vital supplies bound for Britain and the Soviet Union. The lifeline keeping Britain in the war was being severed, and the codebreakers at Bletchley Park were powerless to help. Commander Hugh Alexander, the chess champion who led the naval section, held emergency meetings with his team leaders. The bombs, the electromechanical devices that had successfully broken 3-rotor Enigma, were useless against the 4-rotor system. The mathematics were clear. Even with dozens of bombs running continuously, testing every possible rotor position would take months for a single day's messages. By the time they broke yesterday's codes, hundreds more ships would be at the bottom of the Atlantic. Margaret knew none of this strategic context. Her job was simple and mind-numbing. She was what they called a crib worker. German radio operators, despite strict protocols, occasionally made mistakes, using standard phrases, repeating weather codes or starting messages with predictable military formalities. These predictable elements, called cribs, gave codebreakers a foothold. Margaret's job was to take intercepted German messages and search for possible cribs by comparing them against lists of common German military phrases, weather terminology, and standardized radio procedure. Hour after hour, day after day, she stared at columns of 5-letter groups, searching for patterns that might indicate a standard phrase buried in the encryption. It was tedious work that produced more frustration than results, especially with the new 4-rotor system. The cribs that had worked against the older Enigma variants seemed useless against Triton. Margaret had always kept a diary, a habit instilled by her grandmother, who had insisted that a young woman should record her thoughts and preserve her memories. But at Bletchley Park, keeping any written record was strictly forbidden. The Official Secrets Act they had all signed made clear that even mentioning they worked at Bletchley Park could result in imprisonment. Writing about the work itself was unthinkable treason, so Margaret had developed a compromise. She kept her diary, but she wrote in a personal shorthand system her grandmother had taught her, a simplified version of Pitman shorthand mixed with her own abbreviations and symbols. In this private language she recorded not secrets but feelings, her exhaustion, her homesickness, her frustration at work she didn't understand, her worry for her brother James, serving with the Royal Navy somewhere in the Mediterranean. On the evening of April 9th, 1943, Margaret sat in the small bedroom she shared with 3 other Bletchley women in a requisitioned manor house near the facility. She opened her diary, dated the entry, and began writing in her shorthand about another frustrating day. She had spent 14 hours examining intercepted messages, searching for cribs, finding nothing useful. As she wrote, describing her work in the vaguest possible terms, she realized she was unconsciously using some of the same abbreviation techniques she employed at work. She had developed shortcuts for frequently repeated words, abbreviating message to a simple symbol, using initials for common phrases. It was efficient, saving time and space in her personal journal. She stared at the page, at the compressed notation that would be meaningless to anyone who hadn't learned her system. And then, in a moment that would later be described in classified reports as a cognitive breakthrough resulting from cross-domain pattern recognition, she understood something that had eluded Bletchley Park's most sophisticated mathematical minds. The German naval operators weren't just making occasional procedural mistakes. They were doing exactly what Margaret did in her diary. They were abbreviating, not in their messages but in their mental process. The Enigma machine was so complex, the encryption so time-consuming, that radio operators under pressure, reporting convoy sightings, warning of aircraft, requesting instructions, would naturally seek efficiency. They would develop habits, personal shortcuts, preferred phrases, and if operators developed patterns, those patterns would repeat. Not in obvious ways that codebreakers were looking for, but in subtle statistical distributions. Certain letter combinations would appear slightly more frequently than pure randomness would predict. Certain message lengths would cluster around specific values because operators were using similar phrasing. The human factor, the natural tendency toward efficiency and habit, was creating tiny, barely detectable cracks in the supposedly impenetrable 4-rotor system. Margaret returned to Hut 8 the next morning with a notebook filled with her observations. She approached Sarah Henderson, the senior crib analyst who supervised her section. Sarah was 24, a Cambridge mathematics graduate, and one of the few women at Bletchley Park given responsibility for analytical work rather than just mechanical processing. Margaret explained her theory hesitantly, expecting to be dismissed. Instead, Sarah listened with increasing intensity. When Margaret finished, Sarah said quietly, her voice tight with controlled excitement, "Wait here." 20 minutes later, Margaret found herself in an emergency meeting with Commander Alexander, Sarah Henderson, and 2 other senior code breakers. On the table before them, Margaret had spread out her diary, her personal shorthand exposed to strangers for the first time. She explained how she had developed her system, how it allowed her to record complete thoughts in a fraction of the space, and how it created predictable patterns that someone familiar with her habits could eventually recognize. Commander Alexander, a man known for his patience and methodical thinking, asked a single question that would validate Margaret's entire theory. He said, his voice careful, "You're suggesting that German radio operators, despite years of training and strict protocols, are essentially keeping invisible diaries, mental shortcuts and personal efficiency systems that create statistical signatures we can detect?" Margaret nodded, too nervous to speak. Alexander turned to Sarah Henderson and said something that would launch one of the most intensive analytical efforts in Bletchley Park's history. He said, "Assemble a team. I want every intercept from the past 3 months analyzed for length distribution, letter frequency, at message positions divisible by 5, and time of day correlation with operator signatures. If Foster is correct, the operators aren't defeating themselves with obvious errors, they're defeating themselves with consistency." Over the next 6 weeks, a team of 32 analysts, most of them young women with no formal cryptographic training, worked under Sarah Henderson's direction to test Margaret's theory. They approached the 4-rotor Enigma messages not as random sequences to be broken through brute mathematical force, but as psychological documents created by human beings under stress. They discovered that German naval operators, despite using machine encryption that produced billions of possible variations, exhibited detectable patterns. Certain operators, identified by transmission characteristics and call signs, consistently wrote messages of similar length when reporting similar situations. When requesting ammunition resupply, one operator's encrypted messages consistently ran between 80 and 90 letter groups. When reporting convoy positions, another's messages clustered around 130 groups. These length patterns weren't cribs in the traditional sense. They didn't reveal specific words or phrases, but they provided probability distributions that could dramatically narrow the search space for the bombs. Instead of testing 200 billion possible rotor positions blindly, the machines could prioritize positions that would produce messages of the observed length with standard military vocabulary. More remarkably, the team discovered what they termed efficiency signatures, subtle statistical patterns suggesting that operators under combat pressure reverted to simplified message structures. When U-boats were under attack, reporting aircraft contact or emergency situations, encrypted messages showed statistical anomalies consistent with operators using memorized standard phrases rather than composing original text. By late May of 1943, the techniques pioneered by Margaret's insight had been incorporated into Bletchley Park's standard analytical procedures. The bombs were reprogrammed to test likely rotor positions based on operator signatures and message length distributions before attempting comprehensive searches. The results were extraordinary. Decryption success rates against 4-rotor Enigma jumped from near zero to approximately 40% of intercepted messages within 2 weeks. By June, they were regularly breaking Triton traffic within hours of interception. The intelligence impact was immediate and dramatic. In the first week of June 1943, using intelligence derived from the new decryption methods, Royal Navy escort groups intercepted and defeated 3 separate U-boat Wolfpack formations in the mid-Atlantic. 7 submarines were forced to surface and surrender after sustained escort attacks guided by precise intelligence about their positions and intended attack vectors. Allied convoy losses dropped precipitously. The U-boat crews, surrendering to British warships, were bewildered by the escort's uncanny ability to find them in the vast ocean, to predict their movements, to be waiting at precisely the coordinates where they had planned to intercept convoys. Captain Lieutenant Werner Schmidt, commander of U-boat 412, surfaced his damaged vessel on June 14, 1943, after 18 hours of sustained depth charge attacks that had found his submarine with impossible precision. As he and his crew were taken aboard HMS Starling, he asked the British commander, Captain Frederick Walker, a question that revealed the complete German failure to understand what had happened. Schmidt said, his English careful and correct despite his exhaustion, "Your detection equipment is remarkable. We believed our position was secure, yet you appeared within minutes of our transmission. Is it acoustic? Magnetic?" Captain Walker, Bound by the same secrecy that protected Margaret Foster and thousands of other Bletchley Park workers, said simply, "We got lucky." But it wasn't luck. It was Margaret Foster noticing that her personal shorthand created patterns. It was Sarah Henderson having the vision to treat that observation as a serious analytical hypothesis. It was 32 young women spending 6 weeks analyzing tens of thousands of intercepted messages for subtle statistical signatures. It was Commander Alexander having the flexibility to accept that a 16-year-old with no cryptographic training might see something his Cambridge-educated mathematicians had missed. The irony, which would not be appreciated until decades later when the Bletchley Park files were finally declassified, was that the German military had defeated itself not through some catastrophic security failure, but through basic human psychology. The Enigma machine was, in fact, nearly unbreakable when used perfectly by operators who composed truly random, unpredictable messages of varying lengths with no consistent patterns. But perfect use required perfect discipline under conditions that made discipline nearly impossible: combat operations, time pressure, stress, fatigue. The German cryptographic experts had built a mathematically sophisticated system and then given it to 20-year-old radio operators on submarines being hunted across the Atlantic. They had assumed those young men, under pressure to transmit quickly before Allied direction finders located them, would maintain perfect protocol. They had assumed submarine commanders, reporting urgent convoy sightings or requesting assistance, would compose fresh, original messages, rather than falling back on familiar phrasing. They had assumed human beings would behave like machines. Margaret Foster continued working at Bletchley Park until the European conflict ended in May 1945. She was promoted twice, eventually becoming a senior analyst herself, training new recruits in the pattern recognition techniques that had evolved from her initial insight. She never saw a submarine, never met the sailors whose lives were saved by her work, never received public recognition for her contribution. The Official Secrets Act kept her silent for 53 years. She married in 1947, had 3 children, worked as a school secretary in Liverpool, and told no one, not her husband, not her children, about her wartime service. When asked about those years, she said only that she had worked in civil service administration. In 1996, when the British government finally declassified substantial portions of the Bletchley Park archives, Margaret Foster was 70 years old, living in a modest flat in Liverpool, widowed, largely forgotten by everyone except her scattered grandchildren. A researcher from the Imperial War Museum, writing a comprehensive history of the code-breaking effort, found her name in a classified report dated May 1943. The report, written by Commander Hugh Alexander, credited Analyst M. Foster with pioneering methodology in operator pattern recognition that substantially contributed to breakthrough against 4-rotor naval Enigma variant. The researcher tracked Margaret down and interviewed her over several months. She still had her diary, the worn leather journal with her personal shorthand, the artifact that had sparked one of the war's most significant intelligence breakthroughs. She donated it to the Imperial War Museum, where it remains on permanent display, open to the April 9th entry that changed everything. When asked how she felt about her contribution remaining secret for more than 5 decades, Margaret said something that captured the quiet dignity of thousands of women whose wartime service vanished into classified archives. She said, her voice steady, matter of fact, "We all did our jobs. Mine just happened to involve noticing that people are people, whether they're keeping diaries or sending coded messages. We all look for shortcuts. We all develop habits. I just wrote mine down, and someone smart enough to see the pattern was watching." The 7 U-boats defeated in June 1943 represented just the beginning of the intelligence advantage gained through Margaret's methods. By July of that year, Allied anti-submarine forces were reading German naval communications with sufficient speed and accuracy to fundamentally shift the balance in the Atlantic. The U-boat fleet, which had come close to cutting Britain's maritime lifeline in early 1943, suffered catastrophic losses throughout the summer and fall. By year's end, German submarine operations in the Atlantic had been effectively defeated, not primarily through superior weaponry or tactics, but through intelligence that allowed Allied escorts to be precisely where they were needed, when they were needed. The strategic consequences rippled through the entire war effort. With the Atlantic convoy routes secured, the massive buildup of American troops and supplies in Britain for the eventual invasion of Europe proceeded without catastrophic losses. The Soviet Union, receiving Lend-Lease supplies through Arctic convoys, protected by the same intelligence advantages, survived its most desperate period and began pushing back against German forces. The industrial might of the United States and the resources of the British Empire could flow freely, creating the overwhelming material superiority that would ultimately decide the conflict. And it began with a 16-year-old girl noticing that her diary shorthand created patterns. The story of Margaret Foster's contribution illustrates something fundamental about the nature of intellectual breakthroughs and the blind spots that even sophisticated systems can contain. The German cryptographic experts who designed the four-rotor Enigma system were brilliant mathematicians and engineers. They had created a machine that was, from a purely mathematical standpoint, extraordinarily secure. What they failed to account for was the human element, the inevitable gap between theoretical perfect use and actual operational deployment under combat conditions. The British codebreakers at Bletchley Park initially made the same mistake. They approached the four-rotor Enigma as a purely mathematical problem, trying to build faster bombs, develop more sophisticated analytical techniques, find mathematical shortcuts through the encryption. They were looking for a technical solution to what was ultimately a human problem. Margaret Foster, with no mathematical training and barely any education beyond secondary school, saw what the experts missed because she approached the problem from a completely different angle. She wasn't trying to break the mathematics of the encryption, she was recognizing human behavior. The same behavior she exhibited in her own diary, the same shortcuts and efficiency patterns that all people develop when performing repetitive tasks under pressure. The classified reports from Bletchley Park, now available to historians, reveal that senior codebreakers initially dismissed Margaret's theory as naive. The idea that highly trained German military radio operators would develop detectable personal habits seemed implausible. The Enigma machine's entire purpose was to eliminate such patterns. Several analysts argued that even if patterns existed, they would be too subtle and too individual to provide useful intelligence. What changed minds was Sarah Henderson's insistence on rigorous testing. Rather than dismissing the theory, she designed a controlled experiment. The team analyzed 3 months of intercepted German naval traffic, looking specifically for the kinds of patterns Margaret had described. They found them, not in every message, not even in most messages, but in enough messages to matter. Certain operators showed consistent behavior. Certain types of messages showed statistical anomalies that couldn't be explained by pure chance. The breakthrough wasn't dramatic like in popular imagination. There was no single moment when code suddenly became readable. Instead, it was a gradual accumulation of techniques that, collectively, transformed an impossible problem into a difficult but manageable one. Length analysis reduced search space. Operator signatures provided probabilistic cribs. Time of day correlations suggested likely message content. Each technique individually provided only modest advantage. Combined, they made the difference between blindness and insight. By August 1943, Bletchley Park was routinely producing intelligence summaries based on decrypted German naval communications within hours of interception. Allied convoy routing now incorporated real-time intelligence about U-boat positions and intentions. Escort groups received precise coordinates for interception. The hunter-killer groups formed specifically to seek out and defeat submarines received detailed tactical intelligence about patrol patterns and resupply operations. The German Naval Command, struggling to understand why their submarines were suffering unprecedented losses, despite using supposedly unbreakable encryption, conducted extensive investigations. They examined capture records, interrogated survivors, analyzed British tactical patterns. They concluded incorrectly that Allied radar and sonar technology had achieved decisive superiority. They never seriously considered that their communications had been compromised. The mathematics seemed impossible. The four-rotor Enigma appeared secure. This failure of imagination, the assumption that mathematical security implied operational security, allowed the Allies to exploit German communications throughout the remainder of the war. Even as submarine losses mounted catastrophically, German naval cryptographers remained confident in their systems. They made modifications, changed rotor settings more frequently, implemented additional security procedures, but they never addressed the fundamental vulnerability: human operators under pressure developing efficient habits that created detectable patterns. Margaret Foster received no medals, no public recognition, no wartime honors. She earned approximately £3.10 per week, standard wage for a junior civil service clerk. She lived in requisitioned housing, ate in communal cafeterias, worked 12-hour shifts, and couldn't tell her family what she did. Her brother James, serving aboard HMS Renown in the Mediterranean, never knew that his younger sister's work was helping protect the convoy routes that kept his ship supplied. The women of Bletchley Park, who comprised more than 75% of the facility's personnel by 1943, remained largely invisible in post-war histories. The few official accounts that emerged focused on the senior codebreakers, nearly all men. Nearly all from elite academic backgrounds. The contribution of thousands of young women who performed the detailed analytical work, who noticed patterns, who transformed theoretical cryptographic breakthroughs into practical intelligence, vanished into classified archives. This erasure wasn't malicious, it was simply how wartime secrecy worked. The Official Secrets Act made no distinction between significant and minor contributions. Everyone who worked at Bletchley Park was bound to silence. And in the post-war years, when the temptation to share stories might have been strongest, the emerging Cold War created new reasons for secrecy. The Soviet Union was using machine encryption systems similar to German Enigma. Revealing how those systems had been defeated would compromise ongoing intelligence operations. So Margaret Foster returned to Liverpool, resumed her interrupted life, and said nothing. Her contribution, the insight that changed the Battle of the Atlantic, remained classified until she was 70 years old. By that time, most of her Bletchley Park colleagues were dead. The submarines she had helped defeat were rusting hulks in salvage yards. The sailors she had helped save had lived entire lives, raised families, grown old, never knowing that a teenager in a wooden hut in England had played any role in their survival. When the Imperial War Museum finally put Margaret's diary on display in 1997, the exhibition included a panel explaining its significance. Visitors could see the actual page from April 9, 1943, the cramped shorthand, the personal notation system, the ordinary concerns of a homesick teenager far from family. Next to it, the museum displayed a declassified excerpt from Commander Alexander's report, explaining how that personal shorthand had inspired the analytical methods that broke four-rotor Enigma. Most visitors walked past without much interest. It was just an old diary, some old papers. The dramatic artifacts were elsewhere: actual Enigma machines, bombs, the famous Colossus computers. A teenager's diary seemed trivial by comparison, but a few visitors understood. They were often older, veterans, war widows, people who remembered when submarine attacks were announced on the evening news, when convoy losses threatened Britain's survival. They would stand before that diary and cry, understanding that history isn't just made by generals and politicians and famous codebreakers. Sometimes it's made by a 16-year-old girl who kept a diary and noticed that people develop patterns. Margaret Foster died in 2004 at the age of 77. Her obituary in the Liverpool Echo mentioned her wartime service at a government communications facility, but provided no details. Her grandchildren, going through her possessions, found boxes of letters, photographs, and memorabilia from her life. Among them was a framed certificate from the Imperial War Museum, thanking her for her donation and recognizing her contribution to the wartime code-breaking effort. None of her grandchildren had known. She had never mentioned it. The historical assessment of Bletchley Park's contribution to Allied victory has evolved significantly as archives have opened. Early accounts focused on the famous mathematicians and the brilliant theoretical work. Later research has emphasized the industrial scale of the operation, the thousands of workers, the bombs running constantly, the massive logistical effort required to process intercepted communications. The most recent scholarship has begun recognizing the specific contributions of individual analysts whose insights shaped methodology. Margaret Foster's name now appears in academic histories of Bletchley Park and the Battle of the Atlantic. Her diary is considered one of the institution's most significant artifacts, not for what it says, but for what it represents. It embodies the principle that breakthrough often comes not from theoretical sophistication, but from fresh perspective, from someone outside the established framework, seeing connections that experts miss. The 7 submarines defeated in June 1943 represent only a small fraction of the German naval losses attributable to Allied signals intelligence. Over the course of the war, more than 700 U-boats were constructed by German industry. More than 600 were lost to enemy action. A substantial percentage of those losses resulted from intelligence derived from decrypted communications, submarines located through signals intelligence, patrol routes predicted through traffic analysis, supply operations intercepted through decryption of orders. Each submarine represented approximately 50 crew members. Each convoy saved represented thousands of tons of supplies, dozens of merchant vessels, hundreds of sailors. The mathematical calculation of lives saved through intelligence work becomes overwhelming. Tens of thousands of Allied personnel who survived because convoys were routed away from submarine patrols, because escorts were positioned where they were needed, because hunter-killer groups found their targets. And at the origin of this intelligence advantage, in a chain of causation that stretched across the Atlantic and through the remaining years of conflict, was a 16-year-old girl from Liverpool who kept a diary in personal shorthand and noticed that her efficiency patterns created detectable signatures. The final irony, one that Margaret herself mentioned in her interviews with the Imperial War Museum researcher, was that German intelligence was aware Bletchley Park existed. German reconnaissance had photographed the facility. They knew Britain had invested substantial resources in signals intelligence. They knew that captured German equipment, including Enigma machines, had fallen into Allied hands. They analyzed Allied tactical patterns and recognized that convoy routing sometimes suggested foreknowledge of submarine positions. But they couldn't imagine how the mathematics could be defeated. The numbers were clear. 200 billion possible combinations changed daily. Even with captured machines and known procedures, breaking the encryption in operationally useful time seemed impossible, so they dismissed the possibility. They attributed Allied success to luck, to radar, to sonar, to superior numbers, anything except the truth. They never considered that a teenager with a diary might notice something their cryptographic experts missed. They never imagined that human behavior under pressure would create patterns detectable through statistical analysis. They built a system that was mathematically secure and psychologically vulnerable, and they never recognized the difference until it was far too late. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.